Moving on. Next question we have is from Caitlin Swigert. Best pens for lefties, parentheses, Penabling a friend. So thinking about a lefty gift pen. I thought this is interesting.
Nice.
So what do you think, Drew?
Yeah. Well, first of all, yay for Penabling. Thank you for that. My first thought is probably avoid stub nibs since they tend to be more sensitive to angle and rotation. You really need to, if it's a new user especially. If it's not a new user, then sure, if they can, control that. But honestly, one of the biggest challenges of picking up a fountain pen for the first time is keeping it in that same position. It's very counterintuitive to growing up with just being able to rotate that thing however you want to with a roller ball or a pencil. So that can be a challenge. It's a little bit more of a challenge with a flat stub nib. And I'll say what I said earlier, left-handed grips are often just as varied as right-handed grips, especially in terms of holding a fountain pen. People hold them all sorts of which ways. So I wouldn't say that a pen with a grip, like a molded grip like the 2000, sorry, not like the 2000, like the Safaris or the Lamy All-Stars would be necessarily good or bad, because a lot of right-handed users can't stand those things either, but a lot of right-handed users swear by them and say that they are really helpful in learning how to grip them. So it depends. It could be really helpful, but then it could be the opposite as well. So I would just say take that into account, consider it maybe, but it's not a definite win. And then a lot of left-handed writers, not all of them, but a lot of them are challenged by inks that don't dry quickly. So starting off, like there are a lot of inks that aren't marketed as fast dry inks that are indeed fast dry inks, but it takes a little bit of hunting down to do that. You could always look on our website and check out the reviews. We have a little slider for dry time, and a lot of them have a ton of reviews. So you can check that out and kind of decide on your own whether or not it's a fast drying ink. You'll at least be able to tell if it's definitely not one, because people usually say. Or you could start off with a brand that does advertise the fact that it's a fast drying ink, like Private Reserve. They have a whole line of fast drying ink, so that might be a good starting point for you and your Penableese. And then finally, picking a middle-of-the-road notebook for that same reason. A paper like Clairefontaine or Rhodia is not going, the ink's going to sit on top of those papers for a little bit longer than it would with one of those middle-of-the-road type of notebooks like Leuchtturm. That one is a little bit more absorbent, so picking something like that could be helpful for dry time.
Great points. These are all great points. My opinion is that it's not necessarily so much about the specific pen. Drew mentioned a few. I think if you're dealing with somebody that's never written with a fountain pen, I'm a little more inclined to push something that has more of a triangular grip, just because it does sort of force them to, hold that thing in the right direction, even if that's not ultimately their preference. Going with something like a Lamy Safari or a Pelican Twist or something like that really kind of forces you to hold it in that grip. It's just kind of a good reminder for somebody that's never really had to think about that. So I'm not opposed to kind of pushing somebody in that direction if it's for somebody that's brand new to it all. Or like a TWSBI Eco T. It's got like a very gentle triangular grip, but it's not like so aggressive. It's got these like sharp edges that could really bother somebody. So that could be a good option. Drew mentioned the dry time and smearing. I think that's really important, especially with lefty. If you know this person well enough and you know kind of how they write, a lot of people may write either hook-handed or overhand like this, or like the side writer. Those are the ones that smear the worst. But if it's somebody who's underhand writing with the left hand, you basically don't have to make much of any special consideration from somebody who'd be right-handed, because you're kind of avoiding, all the writing just with your hand position. So you have a lot more freedom and options there. So, that's something to think about as well. I think you're kind of have a balance here between what Drew said, like with the ink, if it dries fast, that kind of thing, with the smearing and all that. You also, because your nibs, you're writing in a push motion when you're left-handed, you're trying to balance out, like trying to minimize that dry time. So having like a finer nib can put down less ink and help with the dry time, but also the finer the nib you go, the toothier it can be, so it may not feel quite as smooth. So it's going to be a little bit of a balance. I think if you go with a fine nib, is going to be pretty safe bet all around. Like Drew said, like avoiding a stub, avoiding a flex and stuff at first. Just try to go with a conventional fine nib is pretty safe bet to get you a good balance there. Go with a pretty conventional ink, something that doesn't have a super heavy saturation, a lot of sheen or shimmer or anything like that. So that if there is any smearing, that's going to be minimized. And then just encourage them to use a lighter hand. A lot of people, when they first use fountain pens, they're used to really having to bear down on things like ballpoints and roller balls, pencils, stuff like that. So really, really, really drilling that home with the new person to somebody who's left-handed, that they're going to be, even more impacted by that push motion, that if they're bearing down really hard, they're essentially like driving down that nib into the paper. So they're really going to want to keep a light hand. So I would encourage, a gift item being something with a pretty stiff steel nib, something that doesn't have a lot of give to it, so that it stays, pretty firm and won't have a tendency to want to dig into the paper like that. I think, going with absorbent paper, fast drying ink and all that Drew recommended is really good. And then as the person, gets to know the pens more and more, they will be able to vary their own experience and can kind of tweak it from there on out based on their own, lefty writing preference.